There was no one who came to the meeting who had an instant answer as to what's causing the inflation of housing prices. And by housing prices, I mean both rental and ownership, nor was there anybody who pretended to have an answer that could resolve the matter immediately and bring relief to people who are very concerned about that, including me. But I will try to go through with you, some things that we will do in the wake of what we heard today, and also, of course, answer your questions. The one thing that people did agree upon in this meeting was that a lot of the price increases that we've seen on all fronts is as a result of our success. We are seeing population growth. We are seeing economic growth. We're seeing investment here, and it is a function in part of the fact that people look at the way we live in Toronto and the way Toronto has, put a different narrative on the record that is causing people to want to be here. But it has caused, and we spent quite a bit of time discussing not just home ownership and what we read about in the and see in the media, which is a lot of the frenzy to do with people trying to buy houses, but also talked about I'll call it the other side of the market, which is the difficulty that is faced by people looking for affordable rental accommodation. And the objective of everything that we're doing here at the city is to make sure that we try and address this issue as best we can, knowing there are limited opportunities for us to do things in some parts of the marketplace across the spectrum, both with respect to home ownership, but also with respect to the availability of rental housing, and in particular, affordable rental housing. And that stems from a concern I think we all have, and Councillor Bailão was in the meeting with me, together with Jennifer Keesmaat and Sean Getzgaden from our housing office, and of course our city manager, Peter Wallace, that we have to make sure Toronto remains affordable for people from every walk of life, whether it be middle-income earners who are looking for an opportunity to buy or stay in a house, or whether it is lower-income people who are looking for an affordable place to rent that is of a decent quality, or people who are looking to buy their first home. We still rank as one of the most livable cities in the world, and housing has a lot to do with that, and it's one of the reasons that I've been so active in partnership with Councillor Bailão, and so forthright with respect to our need for partnership from the other governments to be able to move these files forward. So we convened the roundtable that we did today because I felt that it was very important that as mayor I show some leadership on bringing people together, and they were people from all different parts of the housing world, bank economists through to housing activists, through to United Way, through to development people, to get what ended up being their differing perspectives, although there were a lot of points on which I think they agreed. And it was helpful to me in looking at some things that we can do going forward out of this meeting, but also confirming some things that we are already doing and maybe stepping up the pace of those, and some things that we should pay a bit more attention to. So what I would like to do is just share with you some things that we're working on in this regard. I want to say to you that I indicated to them at the outset of our discussions, and I think I've been very consistent on this, that I am not interested in measures which create the false impression of an instant total solution, nor am I interested in risky measures which would imperil the economy or our own finances. And I've tried to be consistent on that, because it's easy in this business to be sort of stampeded into saying, yeah, that's the answer and let's do that, when in fact, that may not be the answer, and maybe you don't even know what the question is. So there are some things I'll mention that sort of were discussed this morning that we're going to continue to move forward with. Number one, we're working on, but we were told in no uncertain terms by every element of the industry, as it were, that we need to ensure that the city's approval process for everything from planning applications to building permits can keep up with a supercharged market. If you agree with a broad consensus around the table, which is that a big part of the problem is lack of supply, and there was a discussion of both demand and supply this morning, then you understand that in order to address that supply, we have to make life as easy as we can, still recognizing we have important responsibilities to carry out in terms of the proper planning of the city for those who wish to build housing, especially affordable rental housing, but housing of all kinds, to get the approvals and the permits that they need. We have to make sure that the attitude here is an attitude of saying yes and to enabling the construction of housing, especially affordable rental housing, but housing of all kinds, as opposed to sometimes the impression that's created that we're in the business of saying no. And so that message was received. It was received not for the first time, and we have taken various steps, as you know, either through the Open Door program or through things like the plan that we're awaiting now to hire additional planning staff to help us to expedite some of the things that are in front of us. Secondly, I want to look at the effect vacant properties are having on our market. Furthering the perspective held by some that real estate is just another investment. As you get more and more people who may adopt the attitude or the approach that real estate is just another investment, then you have more and more people who might be inclined to buy properties and just hold them and keep them empty as an investment, especially in an environment of rising prices. They don't have to do anything to make money, including taking the trouble to actually rent that property out to somebody, which isn't a bad thing if somebody owns a property and rents it out. In the real world, we look at real estate, in fact, as a place to live, first and foremost and always, and look at it as investment very much a second. The numbers I've seen, and we're still having to work on this because one of the big problems, and we heard about it in this room this morning again, is that there's a lack of really pointed, relevant data that you can say that's the data that definitely tells you the story. But the data that I've seen in this area suggests that there are 65,000 vacant homes in Toronto. And that is a very significant number, and it is a number of homes that are, if they're vacant, are being withheld or are not on the marketplace in terms of supply available to people who are looking for housing, and that has an impact on prices. Vancouver recently implemented a vacant home tax, and I'm open to exploring whether this would be the right measure for Toronto. And I've already begun, before the meeting today, to look at some of the data that we have, which includes things like hydro accounts, water accounts, because they give you some indication as to whether a property is vacant. And then we've asked our officials coming out of this meeting to look at if one was to do a vacant property tax or charge of some kind, how you would go about doing that and how it would work. And so they're going to do that. Unfortunately, we do have a precedent in at least one place, that being Vancouver, and I think there are probably other precedents. Thirdly, it was made very clear to us by a number of the people around the table this morning when we got talking about supply that there is a chain to all of this, so that if you have people that can't get access to rental housing, you know, and there isn't adequate supply, that's going to lead in and of itself to people who are underhoused or not adequately housed, and also it has an impact on the overall housing market as people can't move from place to place within that market, and that's why it continues to be a priority of ours here, and will be going forward to work on making sure that the initial new investments made by the federal government and announced in the budget, which we commended and I continue to commend, and a lot of people around that table commended as being effectively a re-entry of the federal government into the housing business after 30 years of essentially gradual withdrawal from it, must be matched by the same re-entry and serious entry into the housing business and addressing the question of supply by the government of Ontario. I make no bones about the fact that I will be expecting, on behalf of the people of the City of Toronto, and as one of the best ways, albeit not as quickly as other things that I suppose could be done, but the best way to address this ultimately is going to be through addressing supply. And while it takes time to actually build the houses, you've got to start. And you start with the province taking an equal part with the federal government and working with us to stimulate people to get more interested in building that supply so that it becomes available in the numbers were cited in there of 3 or 4 years, but that's how long it takes to actually build these buildings, especially affordable rental housing. This is a must, alongside our expedient approval, more expedient approval if we can do that, and I think this represents our biggest opportunity as a city to increase supply. I should tell you one thing that came up in the discussions that wasn't something that we were having discussion about, and I think it's something that requires leadership of a whole bunch of people sitting around the table together, is how to attract investment into the purpose-built rental business. It was pointed out that one of our major pension plans here, based here in Toronto, and a Canadian pension plan, an Ontario-based pension plan, made its first purchase, its first investment into purpose-built rental just in the last little while, ever. and yet they own rental properties elsewhere in the world and have not done it here. And we have to sort of confront and address this issue of how we can attract private sector capital, pension fund capital, incented by us in governments into this business so that it will stimulate the construction of more rental apartments generally, purpose-built rental apartments, but also affordable rental apartments. It was pointed out that almost all of the rental apartment construction or rental apartment availability that's happened in the last number of years has been, in fact, condos that have been built and rented out. The numbers of purpose-built apartments that have been built for rental have been like literally in the neighborhood of 1,000 units, which if you think about it in the context of a city this big, may in fact contribute to the sort of hubris of rapidly rising prices. And while I didn't expect that I would get anybody from the real estate business to enthusiastically agree with me on that, I was interested in the fact that they said that they very much view the rules and the conditions that govern their practices and this aspect of the marketplace to be set by their regulator, which they described as being fairly weak in the context of setting rules that make sure that people are protected at the end of the day. And so I would just say that I certainly left with them the thought that they might look at their own practices in this regard to see if it's making any contribution to this circumstance we find ourselves in. And I would say I think it's time, and even they didn't disagree with this, that the province took a look at its regulator and at its rules and guidelines to make sure that rules are such that they're discouraging any kind of activity in terms of the way people buy houses and these bidding wars and so on that actually serve to push prices up. And so I will just say in conclusion that it was an extremely constructive meeting. I will say one other thing that was mentioned a bit was ways in which we can use gentle density increases to increase the supply of housing. And laneway housing, for example, which is something that Councillor Bailão has been working quite hard on, and that I know Ms. Keesmaat is working on as well, is something that was mentioned quite a few times around the table as a gentle way, to use their words, that you can increase supply in neighborhoods without disrupting the stability of those neighborhoods, but you do increase the supply of housing. And I think that these are some of the kinds of things they talked about that we're already working on. And the message to us was, see if you can speed up what you're doing in order to make this a reality before too long. I hope people see this meeting today for what it was meant to be, which it was not meant to be a meeting out of which I would emerge and say, Eureka, I have found a magic solution, or somebody came to the meeting and gave us one for the increase in the supply of housing. It was meant to show a deep concern about this. It was meant to make sure people understand that I and my colleagues like Councillor Bailão and Ms. Keesmaat are going to listen to the very best people we can find. And if there are more people we can find to listen to on a further meeting, we're going to do that. And we've said we're going to bring these people together again. And we took from them some things we could do, which we will proceed to both investigate and to act on as seems appropriate. But it is going to have to be, as they pointed out over and over again, a partnership, a much broader partnership that involves the other governments, for sure, stepping up with money and stepping up with incentives to encourage people to build rental housing. It is going to involve the housing sector, both the private and nonprofit, getting involved in working with us to develop those kinds of incentives and, in fact, responding when they're offered. And it's going to be a sort of team effort that is going to try to address this concern and make some meaningful progress. But I come away from the meeting saying the same thing I would have said going in, which is there is no magic wand that I can wave or that anybody can wave. And I think they said that, these people who are expert and spend their lives trying to understand this business that operates in a very complex marketplace.
Mr. Mayor, did anybody in there, especially from finance, express concerns about an unavoidable, painful correction here? My wife does mortgages for a living. I can tell you bankers and builders that in her realm are very concerned. They're losing sleep, worried that measures are taken. We know the province is going to kick in some cash too. The feds have done their part, and the city. But there are real concerns about a painful correction.
The people who were in there said, as has been the case a number of times in the past when we've seen housing prices rise quite rapidly, that there will at some point be something that corrects part of that, and that in fact, if you sort of ask me the way they described that correction, they, in the context of saying that they hope that we as public policymakers take great care in how we go about trying to address this and not get stampeded into doing things that could do as much harm as good, that they didn't actually describe the correction they thought that would come in a way that was scary or sort of calamitous, but that it will come, because that's what happens with markets of all kinds, stock markets and housing markets and so on. And so, and by the way, I mean, they didn't have any particular time they thought it would come or what percentage they thought would be a correction. They just said these things happen if you look at the history. And so I would say, no, I didn't come away saying that they thought there was a calamity about to occur, but they expressed the same kind of concern that caused me to convene the meeting, which is that you can't see, these kinds of increases beyond the anxiety it creates for a lot of people that live in our city. You can't see this kind of go on indefinitely, and these things don't go on indefinitely.
I know some of the people